Welcome to my channel. I'm Roy Clemens, and today I'm going to be talking about the top 13 best monster movies. So let's get into it. At number 13, I have The Ghoulies, which came out in 1985. The Ghoulies is about a bunch of high school kids that discover this black magic kind of ritual thing, and they decide to do it. I don't know why, because that never ends well in any horror movie, does it? So they perform this ritual and they end up raising these demonic little beings called Ghoulies. And they kind of look like gremlins, but they're a little bit different. But I always thought they were cute, like gremlins though. Because they're just these little tiny dudes. And they basically, the whole movie is just about these Ghoulies terrorizing this group of high school kids and literally trying to kill them. And it's a really goofy movie that I think kind of went under the radar after a certain point. I think it was one of those movies that was, pretty popular when it came out in the 80s, but since then I think it's kind of underrated. There is 3 of them, but I think Ghoulies 1 is my favorite. I grew up watching these with my dad and just seeing them on TV all the time when I was younger. It's a great watch. It's super fun. It's just kind of one of those just B-rated horror, cheesy horror movies from the 80s that just make it what it is and make it so great. Moving on to number 12, Horrors of Dracula. This is the first Hammer production film of Dracula starring Christopher Lee. This came out in 1958. This is my favorite because it has one of the most iconic Dracula scenes ever. And so essentially it follows kind of the same storyline as the original Dracula. Jonathan Harker comes to Dracula's castle and, is working for him, and then of course his fiance gets drawn in and he discovers that Dracula's a vampire and scary, and he gets freaked out, and of course he wants to leave. Christopher Lee, I think, starred in about 5, maybe 7 Hammer film Draculas, and in those, I think it's funny because he hardly has any lines in any of them, and he's hardly even really in them. But in his deaths in all of those movies, sorry for the spoilers if you've never seen them, but spoiler alert, Dracula dies in all of them. But he always comes back, and the ways he dies are so ridiculous, and it's what makes it even more fun. That's why I love old horror movies, because the deaths are so goofy, and it's the blood they use is just red paint. And it makes it more I don't know, enjoyable to watch, because it just makes you laugh, because you watch the effects and you're just oh, that's just red paint. And it's and the way that they kill Dracula and all of them so goofy too. And I love, I enjoy all the Christopher Lee Dracula movies. I think the first one's still probably my favorite. Taste the Blood of Dracula is probably next, I would say, which is his 3rd as Dracula, if I'm not mistaken. Moving on to 11, Silver Bullet, which came out in 1985, same year as Ghoulies. This is a Stephen King adaptation of A Cycle of a Werewolf, and Stephen King wrote it, which I always think is cool when he writes his own movies. This movie stars Corey Haim and Gary Busey as his uncle, and Corey Haim is a wheelchair-bound kid, and he essentially gets convinced that a werewolf is killing people in his town, and so he's just determined to figure it out and to find out who the werewolf is. It is I think one of my favorite Stephen King adaptations, and I don't think it gets nearly as much recognition as it should. I think it's just because in the 80s he had a lot of adaptations made, and I think some of them kind of got, I think some of his adaptations from this time period kind of got shadowed by more of the popular ones. But Silver Bullet, I think, is a great werewolf movie, and the werewolf transformation, I think, is great in it. And I think Corey Haim does a great job, but I love Corey Haim and I love his little scary movie that he did, The Lost Boys especially. And yeah, it's on this list just because I think it's kind of underrated. I don't think it's kind of an underrated werewolf movie. Like, I don't think it gets nearly as enough recognition as it should. Anyway, you definitely should watch it. At number 10, it's From Dusk Till Dawn, which came out in 1996. It's directed by Robert Rodriguez, written by Robert Rodriguez and Quentin Tarantino. The movie stars Quentin Tarantino and George Clooney as the Gecko brothers, who essentially rob a bank and kill a bunch of cops and are trying to flee and go to El Rey, which is a place in Mexico. And so along the way, they end up kidnapping a pastor, who's Harvey Keitel, and his 2 kids, because they have an RV, and so they end up kidnapping them and force them to drive them to El Rey, and they're like, we'll let you go once we get there. And along the way, they end up stopping at a strip bar, which ends up being a vampire nest, it's a very unexpected turn. It really is. And Tom Savini does all the FX makeup in it, which it's phenomenal. Of course, is in it. So they're essentially trapped inside of this strip bar with a whole nest of vampires that they have to kill. And I think at this time that this came out, it was, popular, but over the years, I think it's kind of been shadowed and kind of forgotten about as a horror movie. It's more of a horror comedy, I would say, and I feel like it's kind of forgotten about as a vampire movie, and I think it's a great vampire movie. I think it needs more recognition than it gets, so I would definitely recommend this be at the top of your watch list for the next time you want to watch a movie, because it's so great for no reason, and I absolutely love it. It's one of my favorite repeat movies. At number 9, it's The Midnight Meat Train, which came out in 2008. It stars Bradley Cooper and Vinnie Jones, which Vinnie Jones is popular for being in Guy Ritchie movies, especially his early ones like Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels and Snatched. He always plays the hitman kind of assassin guy, and he does not speak at all in this movie, just so you know. This movie is essentially about Bradley Cooper is kind of a struggling photographer, and he's trying to get his pictures in galleries and become famous. So his favorite thing to kind of photograph is the grittiness and the violence and kind of the horror of New York. And so he ends up essentially taking a picture of this man who ends up being Vinnie Jones, and he starts following this guy because he's kind of convinced that he's attached to these strings of murders that have been happening. So he keeps following this guy, he keeps following him, and he ends up witnessing him murdering people. And the murders that this man does are very, very, very brutal. I will say this movie, the death scenes are very gory in it. I think this is, and the thing is, you don't realize that this is a monster movie till like the last 15 minutes. You think it's just about like a deranged serial killer, like literally just savagely murdering these people for no reason. There's no motive, there's no anything. He just picks random people and he slaughters them essentially. And then you don't really realize till, like I said, the last 15 minutes why he's doing those murders. And then once you realize it, you're like mind blown. You're like, what just happened? And this is a underrated horror movie, not only for the gore, not only for the storyline, the plot, the pacing, everything is so well done in this movie. And I can tell you why, because it was adapted from a Clive Barker short story. So if you don't know who Clive Barker is the man who wrote Hellraiser and directed the Hellraisers. So you can kind of know that this story is gonna be messed up, because if you've ever watched Hellraiser, the storyline of it, the plot of it is a little messed up. Definitely messed up. So this is very Clive Barker once you start digging into it. And it's just kind of an unexpected twist. Like, it ends up, I don't want to spoil it for anyone, so I just think it needs to be at the top of everyone's watch lists as well, because I don't think nearly enough people have seen this movie. I think like it really kind of flew under the radar. Like, I randomly watched it one day when it was just on like Stars, and I had never seen it before, and I'm like, what is that? And me and my dad watched it and we're like, whoa. We're like, that was a lot. But it's such a good horror movie, and I definitely think that it's not recognized enough either. So I think it's a great monster movie. So moving on. At number 8, it's the original Creepshow from 1982, which of course is directed by the very iconic George A. Romero, who did The Night of the Living Dead and all of Dawn of the Dead and all of those. And of course it's written by Stephen King. It is another Stephen King adaptation. If you don't know what Creepshow is about, it's essentially 5 different stories happening, and they're all being told by this creature called the Crypt Keeper. And so it's always set up like it's a comic book, because Creepshow was a comic book. And essentially, so in these, I consider this a monster movie because the 5 different stories, you have a lot going on. Like, one of them is about a monster, one of them is about alien grass, and the alien grass one Stephen King stars in. One of them's about just cockroaches everywhere. And then, of course, it's just about, you know, crazy people. Like, one of them's just about, like, this ex-husband getting super back at his wife and his new... And it's got so many people in it. Like, it's kind of insane, the lineup of this movie. And the cinematography of it's insane. You know, it's so good. It's so good. And, you know, Creepshow 2 is good as well. It came out in a few years later, I think 1986. Maybe, I think it was 1986, the second one came out. And even the new Shudder series, where they've redone Creepshow, it's pretty good. Like, there's some messed up there's some messed up stories in those. But Stephen King, I think, Stephen King is just one of the kings of horror. Like, it's insane, like, the storylines he comes up with for these movies and just his books, and it blows my mind how many ideas he has for this stuff. So if you've never watched the original Creepshow and you've watched the Shudder series, or you're just interested in having multiple storylines, you're definitely gonna love Creepshow. It is one of my favorite 80s horror movies for sure, because it's just so kind of out of the box. Not really out of the box, but the storylines in it, the stories itself are kind of out of the box. You'd probably be like, you would be very surprised if you've never watched shows like Twilight Zone or anything like that, where the stories are weirder. But if you have, I think you would definitely enjoy it. At number 7, we have The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad, which came out in 1958, the same year that Horrors of Dracula did. Now, this may seem kind of odd to some people, I guess, because every other movie I've talked about is horror, and this movie is not horror at all. I grew up watching these. There's 3 other ones, and I put this on this list just because of basically the iconicness of the monsters in this. This is one of the first movies to use claymation stop motion and to create all of the monsters. At number 6, it's Army of Darkness, which was released in 1992. Of course, it stars Bruce Campbell as Ash, his recurring role from the past 2 Evil Deads, and of course Sam Raimi is directing and writing. If you've never seen the previous 2 Evil Deads, I would recommend at least watching Evil Dead 2, because Evil Dead 2 ends with Ash getting sucked into a time portal and ends up in medieval times in Army of Darkness. Army of Darkness is my favorite of the 3 Evil Deads. It has all the one-liners that are iconic from it, such as "Hail to the King, baby," and "This is my boomstick," and "Shop smart, shop S-smart," you know. All the great one-liners that Bruce Campbell delivers are all in this movie. So if you don't know what it is, essentially, as I said, Ash gets transported back in time to the medieval times, and he's trying to get back to the present. And so they all think he's the prophecy, the chosen one, and so he gets sent on this journey to go find the Necronomicon, which is the book of the dead, which he reads from, of course, and the other 2, which raises all the evil stuff. It raises all the evil dead, sorry. So he gets sent on this journey to go get the Necronomicon so he can go back in time. And of course he's supposed to say a phrase and he takes the book, but in Ash-like he messes up the phrase and of course sets off an army of darkness to be raised and to attack everyone. So he has to essentially defeat the army of darkness and go home. Like I said, this was one of my favorite movies to watch when I was little. I can remember watching this with my brother on road trips all the time. And it's such a great, I mean, the funny thing is I went to this thing with Bruce Campbell where he screened this movie and he talked about how much he hated making it. Like how much he absolutely just hated it. which I thought was really funny because I think it is the best one for sure. And I definitely recommend watching all three of them just because they're all so good. Like, people are probably gonna think they're bad just because low budget and different things like that, but that's not the point. They're just funny for no reason, and I absolutely love him. I absolutely love Bruce Campbell and everything he does. He's so funny. And then the whole series, Ash vs. Evil Dead, is also great. If you've never watched it, it's on Netflix, I believe, now. I'm still gonna forever be mad that it did not get a new season. It was such a good show, and I'm so sad that they canceled it. At number 5, we have Monster Squad, which came out in 1987, and essentially this movie follows this group of middle school kids who have a monster club, and they all obsess over Universal monsters and the actors. And essentially one of the main characters' little sister gets handed Dr. Van Helsing's diary, and all of these Universal monsters come alive and are trying to get this amulet to like take over the world, and these kids have to stop these monsters. And so of course they're just like, no way, we get to fight Universal monsters. This movie, again, I grew up watching this movie, and I think it kind of does fly under the radar too, just because it came out late 80s, and you know, kind of the stuff that was coming out with, I think it still gets talked about, but it's not as high as people's watch list as it should be. It definitely should be pretty high on your watch list, I will say that, because the lines are great, and the main kid has a shirt that says Stephen King rules on it, and I want that shirt so bad because it just looks so awesome. The whole storyline is just, it's actually good, I will say that. And you know, it's goofy of course because it's just a bunch of kids trying to defeat the Universal monsters, but they're kind of more knockoff Universal monsters. Like, of course you have Frankenstein and Dracula, but then you have like the Gill Man, who's supposed to be the creature from the Black Lagoon, and like some other names like that they couldn't use, which is funny. Number 4, it's a tie. I couldn't pick. They're both Universal monster movies, original ones, and I couldn't pick between which one I wanted, so I just put both. So of course we have the original Mummy starring Boris Karloff from 1932, and The Wolfman starring Lon Chaney Jr. from 1941. I could not pick between these to save my life. They're both my favorite, I think. No, they aren't both my favorite for sure. Lon Chaney Jr., if you don't know this, his father is Lon Chaney, who was the original Phantom of the Opera, and the 1928 version, I believe. And if you don't know the storyline of The Wolfman, it essentially follows Lon Chaney Jr.'s character. He arrives in this town to stay, and he ends up buying this Wolf King from an antique store, and he ends up really liking the chick that runs the store. And so one night he's walking through the woods and he stumbles across this traveling gypsy little thing, and they tell fortunes, and the gypsy ends up being Bela Lugosi, which is kind of a fun little cameo. And if you don't know who Bela Lugosi is, he's who plays the original Dracula in the Universal monster movies, and he's in numerous other monster movies as well. And so basically Bela Lugosi ends up telling him that something terrible is going to happen to him and all of this. So of course Lon Chaney Jr. is freaked out about that, and as he's returning back to his home he's staying at, he gets attacked by a werewolf and essentially turns into a werewolf. The thing is that he doesn't know that he turns into a werewolf. He just turns into it, and then when he comes back he's already back to normal, and he has no idea or he has no idea that this is even happening to him. I just love to point out the transformation from wolf to man and man to wolf. Jack Pierce does a phenomenal job at doing that, especially for that time period. The time lapses of both of them is just utterly just so insane. For the 1940s, you know that man had to spend hours upon hours doing that. So much time. Like a whole day of filming would just be him putting on all of that makeup and then taking it all off, and just put on one thing, take a picture, put on another one, take a picture, it drives me, like, just thinking about that, it's just like, oh my god. But if you've never watched The Wolfman, you need to watch it. Like, it's always gonna be up there on the best monster movies ever, but it's because it is. I think it's such a great monster movie. The Mummy stars Boris Karloff. Of course, everything Boris Karloff does is phenomenal and to a T of perfection each movie he's ever been in. If you do not know the plot of The Mummy, it essentially follows Boris Karloff essentially is a resurrected mummy, and he goes back to how he originally looked when he was, when he died. And so he is basically convinced that the love of his life from when he was alive is reincarnated as another chick that he has been around. So he's eventually trying to find this girl and kind of like own in on her and convince her and make her remember that they were in love when they were together, that she is that person. And it's kind of crazy. Like, again, I'm gonna put thing on the time lapse from how he turns to a mummy and how he turns back to a man. Oh, it's so crazy. Like, it looks so good too. Like, for 1932, it's just crazy to think about that they do it so seamlessly. Like, it looks so good. And it blows my mind, and it looks so good. I mean, if you're a fan of metal, if you're a fan of Metallica, you obviously know Kirk Hammett's a huge monster fan, and he has a mummy guitar, and it's got the whole like movie poster of Boris Karloff's The Mummy on it, and it is beautiful. It looks so awesome. I'm pretty sure he has a Wolfman one too that looks so cool too. So if you've never seen either one of those Universal monster movies, definitely watch them. Same with the other ones as well, The Invisible Man, the Dracula, Frankenstein, and the Creature from the Black Lagoon. If you've never watched any of the Universal monster movies, definitely watch them. They're definitely worth the watch, I would say. A lot of people probably think they're goofy, but I think they're still kind of essential to watch if you're into horror, just because they're what started kind of the monster movies and horror. So at number 3, I have Super 8, which came out in 2011, and it was written and directed by J.J. Abrams. Super 8, I think, is a such underrated monster movie. I think people forget about it just because of the time it came out. I love this movie. I've seen this movie so many times. Super 8 takes place in 1979, I believe, and it basically follows this group of middle school friends that are trying to film a zombie movie on a Super 8 camera. And essentially while they're filming it, they witness a train derailment, and they later learn that it was deliberately derailed by a person because the train was carrying all of these top secret military items that no one was really allowed to see, and they end up seeing them, of course. And so then everything begins to unravel, and they start learning like what the army was hiding, and which ends up being a monster that they were trying to tame in a lot of ways. And then of course the monster gets loose and starts to come after their town and kill people and destroy things. And these kids essentially have to figure out how to stop the monster. And it's a really great movie. I mean, it has a lot of aspects besides just it's a monster movie. It's really funny. The kids in it are really funny, and it has quite a few big actors in it too, I would say. Like, some of the kids went on to star in a lot of other things as well. And I mean, Elle Fanning's in it, and Kyle Chandler, and Joel Courtney. Yeah, they're all in it, and it's just it is a good monster movie, but it has more than just it being a monster movie. It's not just a monster coming and killing everything. It's got a lot of plot than just being a monster movie, which I love that when it's. I love gory movies, obviously. I love gore, I love horror, but I also love when a movie has plot. I don't just love it when it's just like straight up, you know, slicing and dicing people. I do love those, but I also enjoy when a movie does have more plot. At number 2, we have The Thing, which is the 1982 version, which is John Carpenter's version remake of the original The Thing. And this stars Kurt Russell and Keith David. And so if you don't know what this movie is about, it is essentially about all of these scientists who are on this remote little research facility in the middle of Antarctica, and they're supposed to be studying different things, but it ends up that one of their dogs gets infected with the thing, and then it turns into this crazy monster, and then basically all hell breaks loose in this research facility. And then it just becomes trying to figure out how this monster works and who's the next monster. This movie is a very basic answer for a monster movie. Of course, everyone's always gonna put the thing on there, but for good reason, because this movie has everything that a horror and monster movie should have. I mean, this whole movie is just suspense. And the thing is like, you don't know more than the characters know. In a lot of movies, you know more than what the characters know. You don't know anything. You're more lost than they are. Like, you're trying to figure it out with them to figure out who's the infected person, because they look normal until they turn into a crazy monster that kills everything. All of the FX makeup was done by Rob Bottin, and it is phenomenal. Like, it is so good. Like, what he does, like, I watched a lot of documentaries on this movie, and they just talk about how he literally worked himself to death, because he was working 7 days a week, like, literally all day and all night to get all this FX makeup for this movie done. Or, like, he literally had to take, like, I don't know how long of a break after he did this movie, but it is so, his work on it is amazing. Like, the monsters itself should be watched. Like, you should just watch it for the FX makeup alone, not even for the plot, just watch it for the monsters. And the whole plot of this is so well formatted and drawn out, and this movie does not have a happy ending. Of course, most horror movies don't have a happy ending, but this one, you know, doesn't have one at all. Like, you know how a lot of movies that, you know, the ending is resolved, and you can kind of go away like, okay, that happened, then okay. This movie's not like that. This movie ends with even more suspense at the beginning, because you don't know the outcome. You don't know what's gonna happen. You can only assume. And if you have never watched this movie, you need to go watch it right now. You need to go watch it right now. And just, literally, I want you to go watch it right now and come back and comment on this video and just be appalled at what happens. Because I'll tell you, I was. I've seen it so many times since then, and it's still as good as the first time I watched it. Yeah. At number 1, we have Sinister from 2012, starring Ethan Hawke. So this may seem kind of odd. I don't think a lot of people consider this a monster movie, but I do, just because the creature in it is a god, and he's a very evil, despicable being, so I just thought he'd be classified as a monster. So if you don't know what Sinister is about, it's about Ethan Hawke's character is a writer, and he's basically kind of not a struggling, but a failing writer at this point. And so he's trying to find anything to kind of get him another break, you know, to give him a bigger payday. So he essentially ends up moving his family into this house where every family that had been in it had been murdered. And as he's living there, the darker truth begins to unravel. He ends up finding a box of tapes and a movie projector in the attic, and all of those tapes end up containing snuff films of how each and every family was murdered. It's a lot to watch. And this is one of my all-time favorite horror movies ever, because, like The Thing, it's the plot and the pacing and just the whole movie itself is, like, phenomenal. Just the whole kind of, like, idea of this movie and how it was portrayed and how it was made, I don't think will ever kind of be made again. Like, it is such an original horror movie, and I don't think that something like that, like Sinister, could ever really be recreated as to the same degree that it was. Like, this is one of my all-time favorite horror movies, just because it's so good, and was so original. It is so original. Like, the idea of it and just watching it, it kind of just makes you uncomfortable, you know? Like, this is another one of those movies, like The Thing, it ends in not a happy ending. It ends very badly. No, it doesn't have a bad ending. It just ends very badly for Ethan Hawke's character. Like, you thought maybe he would get away, and maybe he would essentially, like, oh, you know, escape this god. No. No. This movie is a big reminder to not mess with those types of things. If you find a box of movie tapes in your attic from a house where everyone was murdered in, don't watch them. It's the big takeaway from this movie. And don't move into a house where a bunch of people were murdered. But I definitely would recommend watching it. And like I said, all of the movies that I listed, I'll put in the description box below. And also, these aren't ranked from best to worst or, you know, worst to best. These are all just kind of ranked just however. They're all great, amazing movies. I'm sure some people would probably think they're not, but I think they're great watches. Even if they're goofy or kind of stupid to some people, I think they're all great watches that you should all watch. And I think they're definitely some of the best I think they're definitely some of the top underrated monster movies out there that I think everyone should kind of watch at least once to kind of get a grip on them. So yeah, let me know if you want a part 2 of this video, and I'll do another top 13, or I'll do a top worst, because there are definitely a lot of terrible monster movies out there as well. Don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching. Bye.